What happens when an 82-year-old janitor watching a brutal street fight suddenly moves faster than the human eye can follow, leaving a professional MMA fighter unconscious on the ground in less than 2 seconds? Welcome back to Tales of Wonder. If you enjoy stories of hidden masters, forgotten martial arts, and the kind of jaw-dropping moments that remind us never to judge a book by its cover, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale. Now, let's begin today's story about the last living student of a legendary martial artist and the night he proved that some traditions refuse to die. The underground parking garage beneath the Dragon Pearl Mall in Hong Kong's Mong Kok district wasn't supposed to host fights. It was supposed to host cars. Sensible, predictable cars that didn't bleed or scream or draw crowds of drunk spectators waving fistfuls of cash at each other. But at 11:47 p.m. on a humid Saturday in August, the garage had become something else entirely. An arena where reputation mattered more than law, and where Marcus the Sledgehammer Chen was about to defend his undefeated street fighting record for the 19th time. Marcus wasn't his real first name, of course. He'd been born Chen Kai Ming, but Marcus sounded more international, more marketable for the Instagram videos that had made him semi-famous among Hong Kong's underground fighting scene. At 28 years old, with a professionally sculpted physique developed through a combination of legitimate MMA training and a pharmaceutical regimen he never discussed publicly, Marcus had built a reputation as the man who could take down anyone foolish enough to accept his open challenges. Tonight's challenger was a desperate man named Lee, a former construction worker who'd lost his job and thought that the $5,000 prize for beating Marcus might solve his immediate financial problems. It wouldn't. Within 90 seconds, Lee was on the ground with a broken nose and the kind of bruised ribs that would make breathing painful for the next month. The crowd roared. Money changed hands. Marcus raised his fists in victory, his muscles glistening with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights, and shouted his standard post-fight challenge. Anyone else? Anyone in Hong Kong think they can take me? This was the part of the performance that made the videos go viral. The taunting, the arrogance, the absolute certainty that no one present could pose a threat. That's when Old Lau spoke up. "You should be ashamed." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, thin and reedy like wind through bamboo, barely audible over the post-fight chaos. Most people didn't even hear it. But Marcus had excellent hearing, a useful trait when you needed to anticipate incoming punches, and he turned to identify the speaker. Old Lau was 82, though most people who saw him daily would have guessed he was even older. He worked as the night janitor for the Dragon Pearl Mall, a position he'd held for the past 15 years after retiring from his previous job as a cloth merchant in Guangzhou. He stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a spine that had developed a pronounced curve over the decades. His janitor's uniform hung loose on his thin frame, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, a testament to a long life spent mostly in obscurity. He was also holding his mop with a grip that anyone trained in traditional martial arts would have recognized immediately as the foundational stance for staff techniques. But no one in that crowd was trained in traditional martial arts. "What did you say, old man?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that came from having his moment interrupted. The crowd quieted, sensing potential entertainment in whatever was about to happen. Old Lau took 3 shuffling steps forward, his mop clicking against the concrete floor. "I said you should be ashamed." Fighting like this, hurting people for money and pride. Your technique is terrible. Your spirit is worse. The crowd laughed. It was the kind of laughter that comes easily when you're part of a pack, and someone vulnerable has made themselves a target. Even Lee, still being helped to his feet by his friends, managed a pained chuckle. Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, amusement, and finally settling on the predatory grin he wore when he smelled weakness. My technique is terrible? Oh man, I've been training since I was 12. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing. I've fought in 3 countries. What do you know about fighting? More than you, Old Lau said simply. But that's not saying much. The crowd's laughter grew louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Fight him, Marcus! Teach Grandpa a lesson." This was where any reasonable person would have expected Old Lau to back down, to claim he was joking, to shuffle away to his mop bucket and the comforting anonymity of his janitorial duties. This was where common sense said the story should end, with an elderly man recognizing he'd overstepped and a young fighter showing mercy by letting him retreat with minimal embarrassment. But Old Lau didn't back down. Instead, he carefully leaned his mop against a concrete pillar, rolled his shoulders in a way that somehow made his curved spine look less pronounced, and said, "If you're so skilled, you won't mind showing this ignorant old man exactly how wrong he is." Marcus's grin widened. This was perfect content, better than the actual fight. An elderly janitor volunteering to be humiliated. The video would get millions of views. He might even trend internationally. "I don't want to hurt you, grandfather. You should go back to your mop." "I'm not your grandfather," Old Lau replied, his tone still perfectly calm, almost conversational. "And you couldn't hurt me if you tried for a year." The crowd went wild. This was beyond entertainment now. This was witnessing someone sign their own death warrant with complete serenity. Even the people who felt uncomfortable watching what was about to happen couldn't look away. Marcus made a show of stretching, rolling his neck until it cracked, shaking out his arms. "Okay, old man, one punch. I'll pull it so I don't kill you. But you're going down, and then you're going to apologize, and then you're going to go back to your mop. Understand?" "We'll see," said Old Lau. They squared off, if you could call it that. Marcus in his fighting stance, weight balanced, hands up, coiled and ready. Old Lau standing in what looked like the posture of someone waiting for a bus, hands loose at his sides, seeming to pay more attention to a water stain on the ceiling than to his opponent. Marcus threw the punch, a straight right hand, pulled to perhaps 60% power, still enough to knock an elderly man unconscious, but not enough to cause permanent damage. It was fast. It was technically sound. It was the kind of punch that had ended 17 of his 19 street fights. And it hit nothing but air. Old Lau wasn't where he'd been standing. He'd moved, not jumped, not ducked, just somehow displaced himself about 2 feet to the left with a movement so economical that several people in the crowd would later swear he hadn't moved at all, that Marcus had simply missed for no reason. Marcus frowned and threw a combination: jab, cross, left hook. These punches were faster, harder, delivered with the kind of technique that comes from thousands of hours of training. Old Lau moved through them like smoke, his body shifting with micro adjustments so subtle that he seemed to be simply standing still while Marcus punched at progressively emptier air. There was no wasted motion, no dramatic dodging. He just wasn't where the punches were landing. And somehow, he managed this while maintaining the general appearance of an elderly man who might need to sit down soon. The crowd's noise changed pitch. This wasn't funny anymore. This was wrong. This violated the natural order. Young, strong fighters were supposed to dominate old janitors. That was how the world worked. Marcus's face reddened with frustration and embarrassment. He abandoned technique entirely and threw a wild haymaker with his full power, the kind of punch that could break orbital bones. That's when Old Lau struck. It happened faster than human reflexes should allow. One moment, Old Lau was evading. The next moment, his right leg was rising in an arc so rapid that it seemed to simply materialize at head height, his body rotating with a precision that made the movement look almost mechanical. The kick connected with Marcus's temple with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a melon. Marcus dropped like a puppet with cut strings. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The crowd went silent. Not the anticipatory silence of people waiting for the next thing to happen. The stunned silence of people whose understanding of reality has just been forcibly revised. Old Lau lowered his leg slowly, wincing slightly as his knee protested the movement, and resumed his slightly hunched posture. He walked over to his mop, picked it up, and looked at the crowd with a mild expression of someone who just reminded a group of rowdy teenagers to keep their voices down in a library. "Someone calls an ambulance," he said. "He'll be fine, but he should get checked for a concussion. And all of you should go home. This parking garage is closed after mall hours. You're trespassing." Then he shuffled away, mop in hand, leaving behind a crowd of people who would spend the rest of their lives arguing about what they'd just witnessed. The video, of course, went viral. 12 different people had been recording, and within 6 hours, compilations of Old Lau's defensive movement and that impossibly fast kick had been viewed 17 million times across various platforms. The Chinese martial arts community exploded with speculation, frame-by-frame analysis, debates about whether the footage had been doctored, and then someone recognized the technique. It was Master Chen Yue, a 74-year-old martial arts historian in Foshan, who made the connection while watching the clip for the 15th time. He froze the frame at the moment of impact, studied the angle of Lau's body, the position of his supporting leg, the trajectory of the kick. "Impossible," he whispered to himself. Then louder, "It can't be." But it was. The technique was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent their life studying traditional Chinese martial arts. The rising kick delivered with such speed that the human eye couldn't track it. The perfect balance. The explosive power generated from complete stillness. It was the Foshan Shadowless Kick, the signature technique of Wong Fei, the legendary martial artist who'd lived from 1847 to 1925 and who'd become one of the most famous figures in Chinese martial arts history, the subject of over 100 films and television series. But Wong Fei had died almost a century ago. His sons had carried on his teachings for a while, but the chaos of wars, revolutions, and the Cultural Revolution had scattered his students and disrupted the transmission of traditional martial arts. By the 1980s, most martial arts historians believe that Wong Fei-hung's specific fighting techniques, especially the most advanced ones like the Shadowless Kick, had been lost to time. Master Chen made some calls, consulted old records, spoke to other historians, and eventually he found a reference in a journal from 1947, a list of Wong Fei-hung students that included a 12-year-old boy named Lao Chi's son, described as promising but small, good with staff techniques. The dates matched. The name matched. The technique certainly matched. Master Chen called the Dragon Pearl Mall at 2 a.m. and asked to speak to the night janitor. When a story broke in the South China Morning Post 3 days later, last living student of Wong Fei Hung discovered working as janitor. Old Lau's life changed in ways he neither wanted nor welcomed. Reporters camped outside his tiny apartment in Shamshui Pa. Martial arts schools offered him ridiculous amounts of money to teach. Documentary filmmakers begged for interviews. The Foshan government invited him to a ceremonial visit. A Hollywood producer called asking about life rights. Old Lau refused everything. He continued showing up for his janitorial shifts. However, the mall management, suddenly aware they'd been employing a living legend at minimum wage, offered him a raise and a day shift. He declined. He liked the quiet of night work. When Master Chun finally convinced him to sit down for a recorded interview to preserve his historical memories, Old Lau was reluctant, but eventually agreed. They met in a tea house in Yao Ma Ti, away from the crowds and cameras. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Master Chen asked. About your training? About studying with Wong Fei Hung. Old Lau sipped his tea slowly before answering. I was only with Sifu for 7 years before he died. I was young. I learned some basics, some staff work, a few of the foundational sets. The Shadowless Kick was the last thing he taught me, just a few months before he passed. He said I had the right build for it. Compact, quick. But I was never a great martial artist. Just a decent student. But you were his last student, Master Chen pressed. The last person he personally trained. That makes you a living link to history. That makes me an old man who learned some things a long time ago. Old Lau corrected gently. When Sifu died, his family was scattered. The times were chaotic. I was just a teenager. I went to work in my uncle's cloth shop in Guangzhou. I used the exercises to stay healthy, practiced the forms when I could, but martial arts don't pay bills. Life happened. I got married, had children, worked, moved to Hong Kong, got old. The Kung Fu was just something I used to do. But you never forgot. No, Old Lau admitted. I never forgot. Muscle memory is strange. I haven't fought anyone in 60 years. But when that young man threw his punch, my body just remembered. And you chose to step in, to stop the fights. Old Lau set down his teacup with a decisive click. Sifu always said that martial arts exist to protect people, not to show off or make money or build reputation. Watching that boy hurt people for entertainment, calling it skill, it made me angry. My teacher would have been disgusted. So yes, I stepped in. Maybe that was foolish at my age. I think Master Chen said carefully that what you did was remind people what real martial arts looks like. What means? There are millions of people studying Kung Fu as exercise, as sport, as performance. But you showed them the original purpose, the real technique applied by someone who learned directly from a master. You gave people hope that the old ways aren't completely lost. Old Lau was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the old ways are lost. I'm 82. I can teach people the forms, maybe show them the movements, but I can't give them the years of training, the cultural context, the philosophy that made those techniques meaningful. When I die, the direct lineage dies with me. That's just reality. But you could teach what you remember. Pass on what you can. To who? The world has moved on. Young people want quick results, championship titles, viral videos. They don't want to spend 20 years learning to stand properly. And I don't blame them. That's not their world anymore. Master Chen leaned forward. But some want to learn. Not everyone, but some. And isn't preserving even a fragment of the tradition better than letting it all disappear? Old Lau smiled, and for a moment, he looked much younger than his 82 years. Maybe. We'll see. For now, I have a mall to clean. The bathrooms on the third floor don't sanitize themselves. Marcus the Sledgehammer. Chen woke up in Queen Elizabeth Hospital with a headache that felt like his skull was trying to split open. The doctors told him he had a moderate concussion and should consider himself lucky it wasn't worse. They also said to him that his knockout had been viewed by approximately 30 million people worldwide, which did nothing to improve his headache. His first visitor, surprisingly, was Old Lau. The elderly janitor appeared in his hospital room at 6 a.m., carrying a thermos of herbal tea. "You shouldn't be fighting like that," Old Lau said without preamble, sitting in the visitor's chair with a slight grunt. "You have some skill, but you're wasting it on ego and money. Your Muay Thai is sloppy. Your ground game has obvious gaps, and your stance leaves your center too exposed. You won a lot of fights because you were stronger and younger than your opponents, not because you were truly skilled." Marcus stared at him, his emotions a confused mixture of humiliation, anger, and something that might have been relief that someone was finally being honest with him. "So what do you suggest? That I study ancient kung fu instead?" "No," Old Lau said. "I suggest you study modern fighting more seriously. Get a real coach. Stop fighting in parking garages for money. If you want to test yourself, join a proper organization with rules and safety protocols. Use your strength to build something, not to hurt people who can't match you." "You hurt me," Marcus pointed out. "I stopped you," Old Lau corrected. "There's a difference. I used exactly enough force to end the situation without causing permanent damage. That's what control actually looks like. Right now, you're like a sledgehammer hitting whatever catches your attention. A sledgehammer is a useful tool, but only when applied with precision to a specific purpose." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "That kick, how did you learn to move that fast?" 60 years of practice," Old Lau said simply. "Starting when I was 12. Every day. Forms, stances, breathing exercises, meditation, conditioning. The kick you saw took 2 seconds, but it took 60 years of preparation to make those 2 seconds possible." He stood up, his joints creaking audibly. "The tea is for the headache. Drink it slowly. It tastes terrible, but it works. And think about what you want to be known for. Right now, people know you as the fighter who got knocked out by an old janitor. That story will follow you forever. But what you do next, that will define whether the story is about your failure or your transformation." He shuffled toward the door, then paused and looked back. "You have potential. But potential without purpose is just wasted energy. Figure out your purpose." Then he was gone, leaving Marcus alone with his headache, his humiliation, and the thermos of truly awful tasting tea that did, in fact, make his headache better. 3 months later, Old Lau was still working as a night janitor at the Dragon Pearl Mall, still refusing most interviews, still living in his small apartment in Shamshui Pa. But twice a week at 6 a.m., after his shift ended, he met with a small group of students in a park near the harbor. There were 7 of them. 3 were middle-aged people who'd studied martial arts before and wanted to learn something more profound. Two were young university students interested in traditional Chinese culture. One was a martial arts historian hoping to document Lau's techniques before they were lost. And one was Marcus Chen, who showed up every session with a notebook and asked questions about stance work with the kind of humble focus that comes from having your ego thoroughly demolished in front of 30 million people. Old Lau taught them the basics: standing meditation, breathing techniques, the foundational horse stance students held for an hour before they were allowed to learn anything else. He told them stories about his teacher, about the philosophy behind the techniques, about the days when martial arts were about character development as much as fighting skill. He didn't teach them the Shadowless Kick. When they asked, he smiled and said, "That took me 40 years to learn properly after my teacher first showed it to me. We have a bit more groundwork to cover first." Was he preserving a dying tradition? Maybe. Or maybe he was just an old man sharing some things he'd learned a long time ago with people who were curious enough to show up early in the morning and stand in uncomfortable positions for hours while he corrected their posture. But on Saturday mornings, when the light rose over Victoria Harbor and his small group of students moved through the forms he taught them, there was something undeniably beautiful about it. Something that connected the present moment to a chain of teaching stretching back more than a century, to a legendary martial artist who believed that Kung Fu was ultimately about protecting people and building character. The world had changed. The tradition had almost died. But here in this park, at sunrise, taught by an 82-year-old janitor who'd once trained with a legend, a small ember of that old fire still burned. And sometimes that's enough. The underground fights in the Dragon Pearl Mall parking garage stopped completely after that night. The management installed security cameras and hired an additional night guard. The crowd dispersed, finding other venues for their entertainment. Marcus's social media following actually increased once he started posting about his training with Old Lau. People loved a redemption story, and he eventually opened a legitimate gym that emphasized traditional martial arts philosophy alongside modern fighting techniques. And Old Lau? He continued mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and occasionally stopping to correct the stance of his reflection in the mall's windows, muscle memory guiding his movements in ways that transcended age, connecting him to a teacher long dead and a tradition that refused to disappear as long as someone still remembered completely. If you possessed a skill or knowledge passed down for a legendary master, would you choose to preserve it for the world, or would you keep it quietly to yourself, letting it fade naturally with your generation? What do we owe to traditions that the modern world has left behind? If this story made you think about the hidden masters walking among us, the traditions we've lost, or the unexpected moments when the past reaches into the present in extraordinary ways, show some love by hitting that like button. Drop a comment below about whether you think traditional martial arts still have value in the modern world, or share your own story about meeting someone whose skills or knowledge completely surprised you. And if you want more tales of ordinary people revealing extraordinary abilities, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate the quiet ones in the background. See you in the next video.